She rode into Gideon Mercer's ranch with nothing but a busted saddle, a split lip, and a list of names that powerful men would kill to keep buried. They'd burned her house, run her out of town like a dog, called her a liar in every church and courthouse from here to the county line. But Rowan Hale wasn't running anymore. She was regrouping. What those men didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined when they struck that first match, was that they hadn't silenced her. They'd just given her nothing left to lose. And a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing in the West. Like this video, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. You won't want to miss a single word of what comes next. The wagon road north out of Callaway Crossing wasn't much of a road at all. It was more like a suggestion. Two shallow ruts pressed into the red clay by years of reluctant travel, winding through scrub pine and switchgrass toward country that most sensible people avoided entirely. Rowan Hale had been following it for 6 hours, and the horse she'd borrowed, or taken, depending on how charitable you were feeling, was making its displeasure known in the particular way horses had, by slowing down every time the trail curved upward and pretending not to hear her heels. "I know," she said. "I don't want to be here either." The horse flicked one ear back, unimpressed. She had a flour sack tied behind the saddle that held everything she still owned. 2 changes of clothes, a small knife her father had given her when she was 12, a bundle of letters she hadn't been able to bring herself to burn, and a folded piece of paper with an address on it. The address belonged to a man named Gideon Mercer, who owned a ranch called the Stone Hollow, about 20 miles north of the nearest town worth naming. She'd gotten his name from a woman named Clara DuPont, who ran the boarding house on Elm Street in Callaway Crossing, who'd pressed the paper into Rowan's hand 2 nights ago while Rowan was still picking glass out of her hair from the broken window. "He takes on hands sometimes," Claire had said, keeping her voice low, watching the door. "Don't tell him I sent you. Don't tell him anything you don't have to. Just work hard and keep your head down, and maybe he'll let you stay." "Maybe," Rowan had said. "That's better odds than you've got here, honey." That wasn't wrong. Her odds in Callaway Crossing had gone from bad to non-existent in the span of about 3 weeks, which was how long it had taken for her to go from being just another unremarkable young woman in a quiet frontier town to being the most hated person within 60 miles. It hadn't been her intention. It had started, as these things often do, with her simply being unable to keep her mouth shut at the wrong moment. She'd worked as a bookkeeper for 2 years for a man named Aldous Crane, who ran the county land office out of a 2-room building next to the feed store. Crane was well-regarded, influential. He sat on the town council and took his family to church every Sunday, and shook hands with everyone he met in that particular way that made people feel like they'd just been touched by someone important. He was also, as far as Rowan could determine from the record she'd been maintaining for 24 months, stealing from a federal land grant program that was supposed to fund homestead allocations for families settling in the territory. Not a little stealing, a lot of stealing. The systematic, years-long cover-your-tracks kind that required keeping 2 separate sets of books. The official one that got filed with the territorial government, and the real one that Crane kept locked in the bottom drawer of his desk, which Rowan had found one afternoon when she was looking for a stamp pad. She should have put it back. She knew it the moment she opened it. She should have closed that drawer, walked out of that office, and spent the rest of her life pretending she'd never seen it. But she'd never been good at pretending. She'd made copies. Careful, methodical copies, written in her own hand on plain paper, capturing every fraudulent entry she could find. Then she'd gone to the sheriff. Sheriff Dalton Mace had listened to everything she said, studied the copies she'd brought, offered her a glass of water, and then shown her out with a handshake and a promise to look into it. Within 2 days, she understood exactly what that promise was worth. Crane had been in Mace's office before she'd made it back across the street. That was the beginning of the end. She was fired by the end of the week. The story that circulated, and it circulated fast, the way stories did in small towns where there wasn't much else to occupy people, was that she'd been embezzling herself, that she'd fabricated records to cover her own theft, that Crane had caught her and dismissed her to avoid a public scandal. By Sunday, it had grown into something uglier. She was unstable, bitter, a troublemaker who'd always had an attitude problem, if you asked the right people, and suddenly there were plenty of right people willing to be asked. The worst of it came from Reverend Silas Boone, who ran the largest church in town and had, Rowan later understood, about 16 years of financial entanglement with Aldous Crane and half the county council. He delivered a sermon that she was told about secondhand, having not been present, in which he spoke at length about the dangers of a proud and ungovernable woman and the havoc such a woman could wreak upon a righteous community. He didn't name her. He didn't need to. Everyone in those pews knew exactly who he was talking about. After that, the doors started closing. The boarding house asked her to leave. The general store declined her business. The woman who'd been her closest friend in town, a woman named Hester, whom she'd known for 4 years, crossed to the other side of the street one morning rather than acknowledge her. That one had stung. The broken window happened on a Tuesday. She didn't know who threw the rock through the front of her rented room because she'd been asleep when it happened. But she woke to cold air and the sound of glass settling and a word that someone had painted on the clapboard outside, which she was not going to repeat even in the privacy of her own head. She'd packed what she could reach in the dark and been in the saddle before sunrise. But the Stone Hollow Ranch came into view around mid-afternoon, cresting a long ridge of yellow grass that swept down into a shallow valley where a creek bent in a slow horseshoe curve and a cluster of buildings sat low against the hillside like they'd grown up from the ground rather than been built on it. The main house was 2 stories of dark timber and pale stone, practical and solid, with a wide porch along the front and shutters on the windows that looked like they could actually close. There was a barn, a bunkhouse, a smithy, and a number of smaller outbuildings she couldn't identify from the ridge. Everything looked weathered and maintained at the same time, the kind of place where someone had spent years keeping things from falling apart without spending much effort on making them look nice. 3 horses were in the paddock near the barn. A man was working near the fence line, his back to her, restringing wire between 2 posts with the kind of focused efficiency that meant he'd done the same repair many times before. She rode down off the ridge. He heard her when she was about 40 yards out and turned to look, one hand still holding the wire, the other dropping to his side without any urgency. He watched her come the rest of the way without any change in his expression that she could detect. Tall, broad across the shoulders. Somewhere in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had been worked over by weather and years into something angular and unhelpful. He wasn't handsome in any comfortable way. He was the kind of man who looked like he'd stopped caring about being approachable some time ago. Rowan pulled the horse up and stayed in the saddle. It was generally better, in her experience, to have the high ground at least for the first 30 seconds. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Yep." He didn't ask who she was or how she knew his name. "My name is Rowan Hale. I'm looking for work. I can mend fence. I can cook. I can keep accounts. I can do whatever needs doing. I'm asking for fair wages or room and board, whichever you'd prefer." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at her flour sack. Then at the horse, which was someone else's brand, though to his credit he didn't comment on that. "Where'd you come from?" he said. "Callaway Crossing." Something shifted in his face. Not much. A tightening around the eyes, maybe. "Long ride." "Yes, sir." "Why here?" "I was told you took on hands." "Sometimes." He went back to the wire for a moment, pulled it taut, wrapped it around the post. Then, without looking at her, "You the one who made trouble with Aldous Crane?" The bottom of her stomach dropped. "Where'd you hear that?" "Ryder came through 2 days ago, heading north to the timber camps. Word travels." "What word specifically?" He looked at her again, those flat, unreadable eyes taking her apart in the way some people had, methodical and unhurried. "That you'd stolen from the land office and then tried to blame Crane when you got caught. That you were dangerous and not to be trusted." Rowan held his gaze. Her hands wanted to tighten on the reins, and she didn't let them. "And do you believe that?" "I don't know what I believe," Gideon Mercer said. "I don't know you. I didn't steal anything. I found records showing that Crane had been stealing from federal land grants for years. I reported it, and then they destroyed me for it." He was quiet for a long moment. The creek made small sounds in the distance. A bird went over. "That's what you'd say either way," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." That seemed to catch him slightly off guard, the bluntness of it. He turned back to the fence, made another wrap of wire, tested the tension. "Bunkhouse is through the barn. There's a woman's section partitioned at the back end. Reba Callis sleeps there. She cooks and keeps the house. You'll answer to her in the mornings." Rowan let herself exhale, slowly, so it wouldn't show. Thank you. Don't thank me. I need the hands, and I'm not in the business of turning people away in this country. That's all this is. Understood. Wages are room, board, and $4 a month. You'll earn it. I don't doubt that. He pointed toward the barn without looking at her again. Put the horse in the third stall. There's water and oats. She climbed down and led the horse toward the barn, and she was almost to the doors when he spoke again from behind her. Hail. She stopped, turned. The man who sent the rider. I know Crane. Knew him, anyway, years back. He paused, like he was deciding something. He's not a man who lets things drop. I know, she said, just so you understand where you've come. I understand, Rowan said. I didn't come here to escape what I started. I came here to survive long enough to finish it. He didn't answer. She turned and walked into the barn. Ooh. Reba Callis was 53 years old, built like someone had assembled her out of iron parts, and had very little patience for women who thought frontier life would be romantic. She made this clear to Rowan within the first 10 minutes of their acquaintance, while she was handing her a broom and pointing at the kitchen floor. I don't want your story, Reba said. I've heard 100 stories. Sweep. Rowan swept. The bunkhouse had 3 other hands. A young man named Cale, who was maybe 20 and looked younger, a middle-aged Mexican man named Hector, who spoke limited English but communicated very effectively through expression alone, and an older ranch hand named Dub, who had a bad knee and a good memory for weather patterns. None of them asked her any questions the first evening. Cale kept stealing looks at her across the dinner table, and Dub studied the wall, and Hector passed her the potatoes with the neutral efficiency of a man who'd seen stranger things than a woman showing up out of nowhere with a split lip and a borrowed horse. The lip was still swollen from where she'd caught the edge of the door frame when she'd been scrambling out of her room the night before. She'd forgotten about it until Reba, setting down a bowl of stew in front of her, glanced at it once and then looked away in a very particular way that meant she'd noticed and filed it and would not be commenting on it. Do we start before sunrise? Rowan asked. We start when there's light to see by, Reba said. That's usually 40 minutes after sunrise this time of year. You'll hear the triangle. I'll be up. Reba said nothing, but she brought her a second bowl of stew without being asked, and in Reba's particular language, Rowan was slowly learning this meant something. The work was hard. Not harder than she'd expected, but hard in a physical and grinding way that her body, built more for sitting at a desk than for ranch labor, protested vocally for the first 3 days. Her hands blistered, and she kept them wrapped in cloth strips and did not say anything about the pain because there was nothing useful to say. She fed horses, mucked stalls, carried water, repaired a section of roof on one of the outbuildings, helped Hector string new fence wire along the eastern pasture boundary, dug a drainage channel behind the barn that was flooding every time it rained. She also kept the accounts. This happened because on her 3rd morning she found a pile of receipts, invoices, and ledger sheets on the kitchen table that Reba explained had been sitting there for 6 weeks because there was nobody to deal with them. Gideon Mercer, she said, was not a man who enjoyed numbers. Does he object to someone else handling them? Rowan asked. He hasn't had anyone to object to, Reba said. By evening, she'd organized the pile, identified 3 billing errors from a supplier in town, and reconciled 2 months of feed purchases against the ledger. She set the finished work on the kitchen table and went to bed. The next morning, it was gone. She never asked where it went. Gideon never mentioned it. But a few days later, another pile appeared on the table. She understood. This was how he communicated. She began to understand him in pieces, the way you understood terrain by walking it rather than looking at a map. He was up before everyone else and asleep after most of them. He ate quickly and without pleasure. He gave directions in short sentences and didn't repeat himself. He expected his instructions to be followed correctly on the first attempt, and was neither harsh nor warm when they weren't, just direct. He had a scar along his left forearm that looked old and deliberate, though she never asked about it. He'd been married and his wife had died, and the ranch had a particular quality about it. Small touches here and there, a good curtain in the main room, a well-made cabinet in the hallway, that suggested she'd made it something more than functional, and that nothing new had been added since. He watched Rowan work without appearing to watch her. She developed a peripheral awareness of him that she didn't like admitting, because it suggested a vulnerability she wasn't interested in having. One evening at the end of her first week, she was on the porch splitting kindling when he came out of the house and sat down on the steps. Not next to her, just nearby. And that way some people have of occupying space without quite joining you. "You're doing all right," he said. This seemed to cost him something. "Thank you." She split another piece. "Am I keeping the accounts to your satisfaction?" "Better than that." A pause. "Where'd you learn?" "My father. He ran a dry goods store. I kept his books from the time I was 14. She set the next piece on the block. "He died when I was 20. I needed work, so I found some." He nodded slowly. "Crane's operation." "Eventually. I started with a freight company up in Denton. 2 years there, then moved south, then Callaway Crossing." She swung the axe. "I should have left 2 years ago. But the work was good and the pay was steady, and I told myself the rest of it didn't matter." "The rest of it?" She looked at him. "Knowing that something was wrong, right under my hands every day. I kept thinking I was imagining it, or that it wasn't my problem." She split the wood. "It was my problem. It just took me too long to do anything about it." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "My wife used to say that the things you ignore don't go away. They just get bigger." It was the first time he'd mentioned her. Rowan kept her eyes on the wood. "She sounds like she was right. She usually was." He stood up. "We're moving cattle to the upper pasture tomorrow. I'll need you on the east flank. Cale will show you the signals. I'll be ready." He went back inside. She finished the kindling and stacked it by the door and stood for a moment in the cooling evening air, looking out at the dark tree line and the stars pressing down over the valley. It was quiet in a way that city-raised people might have found oppressive, but that she'd always found like a hand on the shoulder. Steady, impersonal, without judgment. She was still alive. She was still standing. That was something. The first sign of trouble came on a Thursday, 11 days after she'd arrived. She was in the barn doing morning feeding when she heard the horses in the paddock go unsettled. That particular shift in their movement and breathing that meant something was wrong in the wind. She stepped out of the barn and shaded her eyes and saw 2 riders coming down off the north ridge. Then she looked more carefully and understood they'd come from the south, from the direction of town, and had looped wide to come in from the north instead. Men who came to a ranch from the direction opposite their origin were men who'd considered their approach. She went inside and found Reba. 2 riders, she said, coming in from the north. They circled. Reba's hand stopped on the bread dough for a half second. Then they resumed. "Go tell him." Gideon was in the smithy. He came out when he heard her and looked where she pointed, and his face did that thing, that small, controlled adjustment, that meant he'd registered something. "Get inside," he said. "Not running, just walk normal and get inside." She went. She watched from the kitchen window as the riders came into the yard. She recognized one of them. His name was Walt Pryor, and he was a deputy under Sheriff Mace in Callaway Crossing. She'd seen him twice, once when she'd been escorted out of the sheriff's office, and once in the street 2 days before she'd left, when he'd been watching her from across the road with his thumbs in his belt and the particular expression of a man who's been told to keep an eye on something. The other man she didn't know. He wasn't wearing a badge. She couldn't hear this conversation. Gideon stood in the yard with his arms at his sides and his posture very still, the way a man stood when he was keeping himself from doing something. Pryor gestured. The other man said something. Gideon shook his head once, slowly, the way you shook your head at something you found barely worth addressing. The conversation lasted about 5 minutes. Then Pryor and the other man rode out. Gideon came into the kitchen. He looked at Rowan standing at the window. "They want you to leave," he said. She'd expected this. And they indicated there would be legal and other complications for anyone who gave you shelter. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "Pryor said there's a complaint filed against you. Theft. They haven't issued a warrant yet, but they're saying they will." Rowan felt the cold move through her chest. "It's fabricated." "I figured." He looked at his hands on the table, then at her. "They also said the ranch could face a land dispute if you stay here, that there were some questions about the property line on the eastern pasture that someone might suddenly find interest in examining. They're threatening you." "They're trying to." He said it without heat. "I've had my land threatened before. It doesn't move me." "Gideon." She sat down across from him. "I don't want to bring this here. Whatever I've walked into, it's mine, not yours." If they're going to come after the ranch because of me, they came after my ranch, he said, interrupting her for the first time since she'd arrived. His voice was even, not angry, just definite. They decided to do that. I didn't invite it, and neither did you. What happens now is on them. She looked at him. You don't know what you're stepping into. Tell me. So she did. All of it. The ledger, the land grants, the 2 sets of books, Crane's network, because she'd had 11 days to think it through, and she'd begun to understand it was bigger than just Crane. Mace was in it. She was almost certain Boone was in it, had been in it for years. There were others she couldn't name yet, men whose names appeared in the false entries in ways she'd been too close to see when she was inside it, but could see clearly now from the outside. Gideon listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. How much did they steal? He asked. From the federal program alone over the last 7 years? My best estimate is somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000. He absorbed that. Who else knows what you found? No one who's still talking? The copies you made, where are they? She hesitated, then, hidden, somewhere they won't find them. He nodded slowly, like that was the right answer, and didn't push for the location. She respected that. All right, he said. All right, what? All right, we deal with it. He pushed back from the table. Go tell Reba we might need to keep supper late. I have to think about some things. She stood up, then stopped. You should understand what this could cost you. I've lost things before, Gideon Mercer said, without particular emotion. I'm still here. She went to find Reba. That night she lay in her bunk in the partitioned section of the bunkhouse and listened to the ranch settle around her, the creak of timber, the distant sounds of horses, the creek running somewhere in the dark. And she thought about the moment in the sheriff's office when she'd laid her copies on Mace's desk and watched his face and known, even then, in some distant animal part of her brain, that she'd made a mistake she couldn't undo. Not the mistake of reporting it, the mistake of trusting the wrong person to act on it. She wouldn't make that mistake again. She understood now that what she'd brought to this valley was not just her own trouble, but the slow-moving edge of something much larger, and that Gideon Mercer had just quietly agreed to stand in front of it with her. She didn't know why. She didn't know enough about him to guess. But she recognized something in the way he'd said, I've lost things before. Not as a boast and not as a complaint, just as a plain fact about the shape of his life. That she'd heard in her own voice sometimes when she was trying not to sound afraid. She hadn't expected to find a man who understood that particular tone. But here, at the edge of the world, with enemies already moving in the dark behind her, she had. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would work. She would earn her place here. She would be ready when they came, and they would come. She had no illusions about that. Crane and Mace and Boone had too much at stake, and too much contempt for anyone who challenged them to let this rest. But for the first time in 3 weeks, she was not alone. She let herself sleep. The second visit came faster than either of them expected. 6 days after Pryor and his companion rode out of the Stone Hollow yard, 3 men appeared on the south road at mid-morning. Not at dawn, not at dusk, but in the full light of day, which was its own kind of statement. Men who came in daylight wanted to be seen. They wanted you to understand they weren't hiding. Rowan was on the roof of the smaller outbuilding, replacing shingles that had split over the winter, when she heard Cale's low whistle from the paddock. She looked up and counted them. 3 horses. 2 men she didn't recognize, and 1 she did. A broad man with a silver watch chain visible even from that distance, riding a pale horse with the kind of easy confidence that came from decades of never being told no. Aldous Crane. She stayed on the roof. She didn't climb down, and she didn't hide, and she kept her hands moving on the shingles even though her heart had shifted into something faster and less controlled. She'd known he would come eventually. She hadn't expected him to come himself. Gideon came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He positioned himself in the yard and waited, which was the only correct response. You didn't walk toward men who came to you with that posture. You made them do the traveling. Crane dismounted with the ease of a heavier man who'd been riding all his life and crossed the yard with his hat in his hand, not because he was being respectful, Rowan knew, but because holding a hat gave your hand something to do while your mouth was working. She'd seen him use this trick 100 times in meetings, and she recognized it now for what it was: performance. She couldn't hear the conversation from the roof, but she watched it the way you watched weather moving across a valley, reading the shapes and speeds rather than the specific details. Gideon's posture stayed closed and flat. Crane gestured toward the house twice, toward the road once. One of the men behind him rested his hand on his belt in a way that wasn't quite threatening, but wasn't quite not. The conversation ran longer than the last one, maybe 15 minutes. At the end of it, Crane put his hat back on, said something that made Gideon go very still for a moment, then turned and mounted up. He looked at the roof before he rode out. Right at her. He touched the brim of his hat. She looked back at him and did not move. When they were gone, she climbed down. Gideon was standing at the edge of the porch when she crossed the yard. His jaw was set in that particular way she'd started recognizing. Not anger, something harder than anger, more like the look of a man doing arithmetic on an unpleasant sum. "What did he say?" she asked. "He was very polite about it." The way Gideon said polite made the word sound like a disease. "He said he had no personal issue with me, that this was a legal matter and he was simply acting in the county's interests. He said if I released you into his custody voluntarily, the land questions he mentioned, the eastern pasture, would disappear. And if you don't, then a warrant gets issued in the next week. They'll send a marshal to execute it, and anyone obstructing a legal warrant faces charges themselves." He paused. He also said something else. She waited. "He said he'd heard I was having trouble refinancing the operating note on the ranch, that a man in his position might be able to make certain things easier for a neighbor who showed good faith." Rowan felt something go cold and quiet in her chest. "Is that true? The note?" Gideon's jaw moved. "It's true that the bank's been slow about it. Nothing I can't handle. If he has connections at the bank, he has connections everywhere. That's the whole point." He looked at her. "He wanted me to know he could reach anywhere I tried to stand. That's all that conversation was. A demonstration." She sat down on the porch step. Not because she was tired. She was always tired now. That was just the baseline. But because she needed to think without the ground moving under her. She pressed her palms against her knees and stared at the dirt. "I should go," she said. "Not to him, but away from here. Somewhere else." "Where?" She didn't answer because they both knew the answer was nowhere. She had no money, and no allies, and no safe direction to ride. The flour sack she'd arrived with was still her entire inventory of worldly possessions. She'd been here 2.5 weeks, and she was earning her keep, and she had 17 days of wages that wouldn't get her more than 2 counties away before she was stranded again, somewhere worse. "You're not going anywhere," Gideon said. Not warmly, just as a statement of fact, the way he said most things. "We're going to deal with this. I heard you say that the first time. I've been waiting for the part where you explain what that means." He looked at her for a moment, something shifting in his expression that she couldn't fully read. He'd been looking at her differently in the past few days, not strangely, but with a slightly different attention, the way you looked at something you'd initially categorized one way and were now quietly reconsidering. "I'm working on it," he said. "That's not reassuring." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He went back inside. She stayed on the step and watched the south road for a long time after the dust settled, thinking about the way Crane had touched his hat brim. Not threatening. Worse than threatening. Certain. Hector was the one who found the cattle. It was 4 days after Crane's visit, and he came back from the upper pasture at a pace that told Rowan something was wrong before he'd said a word. She was at the fence line when he rode in, and she turned and watched his face and called Cale over with a tilt of her head. 3 steers dead in the northwest corner of the upper pasture. No sign of natural cause. Hector's Spanish was faster than his English when he was upset, and he was very upset now, and Rowan caught enough of it. No injury, no predator sign, no water problem, to understand what he wasn't saying directly. They'd been poisoned. She went and found Gideon. He rode up to see it himself, and he crouched by the nearest animal for a long time without speaking. Dub, who'd come along, walked the fence line with that hitching gait of his and came back shaking his head. "No break," Dub said. "No tracks at the water line. Whoever did it knew where to come in." Gideon stood up. His face was expressionless in the way that, she was learning, meant the emotion was there but too large and too dangerous to put on the outside. He looked at the dead animals for another few seconds, then turned and walked back to his horse. "How much is the loss?" Rowan asked, falling in beside him. 3 steers at current weight, maybe $45. He mounted up. It's not the money. I know. It's a message. I know that too. They rode back to the ranch in silence, and that evening she helped Hector and Kayleigh with the grim work of dealing with the carcasses, while Gideon sat at the kitchen table with paper and a pen and did not come out for 2 hours. When he did come out, his expression had changed slightly. Still controlled, but with something underneath it that was more like resolution than anger. Sit down, he said. Reba was at the stove. Kale and Hector were at the table. Dub was in the doorway. Rowan sat. I'm going to say something, Gideon said, and I want everyone to understand I've thought it through. He paused. The pressure on this ranch is going to increase. What happened today is the first physical move in a pattern I've seen before in other contexts, and it won't be the last. They're going to keep going until something breaks. Nobody spoke. I can't prove who did it. Not yet. What I can do is make certain decisions that change the legal position of everyone here. He looked at Rowan. I've been thinking about this for a week. There's a protection available to you that would make the warrant they're threatening significantly more complicated to execute. Rowan looked back at him. What protection? He said it plainly, with no preamble. Marriage. A legal marriage would establish residency and property rights that would require any warrant to go through territorial court rather than county. Crane doesn't have contacts at the territorial level, at least not that I know of. It would slow them down and give us time to build a real case. The kitchen was very quiet. Kel was staring at his hands. Reba had stopped stirring whatever was in the pot, but hadn't turned around. Hector's face was beautifully neutral. Rowan kept her eyes on Gideon. You're serious. I don't say things I'm not serious about. A marriage of convenience, on paper. Yes. She thought about that for a moment. Not about the idea itself. She'd been turning over possibilities in her mind for weeks, and this one had occurred to her distantly, only to be dismissed as absurd. But about what it would mean for him. His name, his reputation, whatever peace he'd built out here in this valley since his wife died. They'll use it against you, she said. They'll say you're protecting a thief, that you've been corrupted. They'll come after your standing in whatever community. I don't have much standing in that community, he said. I've kept my distance from Callaway Crossing for 3 years. There's not much left for them to damage. Your banknote, if they call it, I'll find another way. He said it the way he said most things, flat and final and not inviting argument. This isn't about what it costs me. It's about what's right. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. There was nothing romantic in it. That wasn't what this was. It was 2 people in difficult country having a practical conversation about survival, and somewhere in the back of her mind she registered that this was one of the stranger moments of her life, and she'd had some genuinely strange moments. All right, she said. All right. I want it understood between us. It's understood, he said, before she could finish. What it is, what it isn't. She nodded. He nodded. Reba went back to stirring. Cale looked up from his hands and said very quietly, Congratulations, I guess. Nobody laughed, but the tension in the room dropped about 3 degrees, which was enough to breathe. They rode to Harlow Junction the next morning, which was the nearest town with a justice of the peace and far enough from Callaway Crossing's reach that Crane's network didn't extend there with full confidence. Reba came as a witness. Hector came because Gideon asked him to, and Hector generally did what Gideon asked. The justice of the peace was a small, brisk man named Terence Fogel, who did not seem particularly interested in the emotional dimensions of the ceremony. He read the necessary words. Gideon said what he was supposed to say in a voice that didn't waver. Rowan said what she was supposed to say and noticed that her own voice was steadier than she expected, which either meant she was calmer than she thought or more numb. Fogel recorded it in the county register. Reba signed. Hector put an X where Fogel pointed, since his written English was limited. Gideon paid the fee. They rode back to Stone Hollow mostly in silence. Partway home, Reba pulled her horse up alongside Rowan's and rode with her for a while without saying anything. Then she said, He hasn't done anything like this since Margaret died. Margaret. The name landed quietly. Rowan had guessed the wife's name started with an M from the initials she'd seen carved into the cabinet in the hallway, but she hadn't asked. "I know," Rowan said. "I'm not saying it to make you feel something," Reba said. "I'm saying it so you understand the size of what just happened. He doesn't do things like this. He doesn't let people in, not since her. This isn't letting someone in." "Maybe," Reba said. "Maybe you keep telling yourself that." She pulled her horse back and rode behind them the rest of the way, and Rowan stared at the road ahead and thought about nothing in particular, very deliberately. The warrant came 9 days later. It arrived not with a territorial marshal, as Crane had threatened, but with Walt Pryor and 2 other county deputies who rode into the Stone Hollow yard on a Tuesday morning, looking like men who'd been told this would be simple and were starting to have doubts. Gideon met them in the yard with a folded document of his own. He handed it to Pryor, who opened it with the expression of a man expecting a trick and finding one: the marriage certificate, witnessed and county registered. A copy of the territorial statute that governed warrant jurisdiction for married property holders. A brief letter from a territorial court clerk in Harlow Junction confirming the registration. Pryor read it slowly. His face went through several stages. "This doesn't change the underlying charges," he said. "It changes the jurisdiction," Gideon said. "You know it does. Any attorney will tell you the same thing." "Crane's got attorneys." "So do I." He didn't. He'd written to one the day before and hadn't heard back yet, but Pryor didn't know that. Pryor looked at the document again, then at the house, then at Gideon. "You understand what you're doing here, Mercer." "I understand exactly what I'm doing. This woman is my wife," Gideon said. The word came out of him with no particular ceremony, just flat and final. "And she's inside and you don't have jurisdiction, and if you attempt to take her from this property, you'll be in violation of Territorial Statute 44, which I'd recommend you look up before you make your next move." Rowan was watching from the kitchen window again, the same window she'd stood at the first time. She had the copies of her documentation in her hands, wrapped in oilcloth. She'd been sleeping with them under her mattress for 2 weeks. Pryor folded the document and handed it back to Gideon and stared at him for a long moment. "He's not going to stop," Pryor said, and his voice had changed slightly, something almost like a warning in it now, something that sounded less like a deputy doing his job and more like one man telling another man the truth. "You know that, right? You've stepped into something that doesn't have a clean way out." "I know," Gideon said. "Tell him that didn't stop me." Pryor mounted up. The 2 deputies, who hadn't said a word throughout, followed. They rode back the way they'd come, and Gideon stood in the yard watching until they'd cleared the ridge. When he came inside, Rowan was still at the window. She turned. "That held them," she said. "For now. For now is what we have." She looked at the oilcloth in her hands. "We need to find a way to move this to someone who can act on it. Not the county, not Mace. Someone with real authority. There's a federal land office in Weston. That's 2 days' ride. If we can get this documentation to a federal agent, then it becomes their problem instead of ours." He looked at her. "I know a man. I haven't spoken to him in years, but I know him. His name is Aldridge. He was a territorial inspector before he moved into federal work. He's honest, or he was. Can you reach him?" "I can send a letter." He paused. "It might take 2 weeks to hear back, maybe 3. 2 weeks, 3 weeks. She thought about the dead cattle. She thought about the way Crane had touched his hat brim. "Then we send it today," she said. He nodded. He went to the desk. She stood at the window a little longer, watching the empty ridge where Pryor's dust was still settling, and felt the weight of what was coming. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling before a storm, when the air pressure shifts and the light goes strange, and every animal in the valley gets quiet at the same time. They were past the point of backing down. She'd known that since Callaway Crossing. What was new was that now she had someone standing beside her, and the ground under her feet had a name on a piece of paper. It wasn't safety, but it was something solid to stand on, and in this country, at this moment, that was worth more than she could say. The letter to Aldridge went out on a Tuesday, carried by a freight rider heading north toward Weston, who Gideon had used before and trusted at the level you trusted anyone out here, meaning not completely, but enough. They'd wrapped the documentation copies in a second layer of oilcloth and sealed the whole thing with wax, and Gideon had written the address himself in his cramped, practical handwriting. Rowan had watched him press the seal and felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Not hope, exactly. More like the act of placing a bet you weren't sure you could afford to lose. That had been 11 days ago. No reply yet. In the meantime, the ranch kept working, because ranches didn't stop for human emergencies. The cattle needed moving, the fence needed maintaining, the accounts needed keeping, and Reba's kitchen kept producing 3 meals a day with the relentless mechanical regularity of a woman who understood that people in difficult situations still needed to eat. Cale had started carrying a rifle when he went out to the pastures, which nobody told him to do, and nobody told him to stop. Hector sharpened his knife one evening and put it in a different place on his belt, closer to hand. Dub watched the roads. Rowan watched everything. She'd started making notes, not the financial documentation. That was already done, already sealed and sent. These were different. Names, dates, incidents. The exact words Pryor had used in the yard. The day and time the cattle died. The way Crane had looked at her from horseback. The man with the silver watch chain who'd accompanied Crane on that second visit, and whose name she still hadn't been able to confirm. She wrote it all in a small notebook she kept in her shirt pocket, because she had learned the hard way that memory was not enough. Memory could be argued with. A notebook in your own handwriting, dated and specific, was harder to dismiss. Gideon found her at it one evening, sitting at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed. "What are you writing?" he asked. He'd come in for water and stopped when he saw her. "A record. Everything that's happened since I arrived. Every contact, every threat, every incident." She looked up. "If this ever gets to a court, I want to have something that isn't just my word." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. He looked at the notebook, then at her. "That's smart. It's what I should have done from the beginning, in Callaway Crossing. I kept financial records because that was my job, but I didn't keep personal records." She closed the notebook and set it flat on the table. "I kept thinking it would resolve itself, that someone would do the right thing and I wouldn't need to have everything written down. And now you know better." "Now I know better." He was quiet for a moment. He had a glass of water in his hand, but he hadn't drunk from it yet. "Margaret kept a journal," he said. "Every day, for years. After she died, I couldn't open it for a long time." He paused. "Then I read it, all of it. Took me 3 weeks." Rowan waited, the way she'd learned to wait with him, without filling the silence, because he didn't like silence filled. "She was smarter than I gave her credit for," he said. "While she was alive, I thought I understood her. Reading it, I realized I'd missed about half of what she was actually thinking." He looked at the water glass. "That bothered me more than I expected it to." "Most people miss half of what the people around them are thinking," Rowan said. "That's not a failure. That's just being human." "Maybe." He drank the water and stood up. "Get some sleep. We're moving the south herd at first light." He went upstairs. She sat at the table a while longer and stared at the closed notebook, and thought about a woman she'd never met, writing her private thoughts into a journal in this same kitchen, in this same quiet, and a man upstairs who'd read every word too late. The fire started on a Saturday night. She smelled it before she heard anything. That particular wrongness in the air that woke her from a sound sleep at something past midnight, when the ranch was fully dark and the moon had gone behind clouds. She was on her feet and at the partition door before she was fully awake, one hand on the wall to orient herself. Smoke. Coming from outside, not inside. She moved to the bunkhouse door and pushed it open and saw the orange glow against the sky from the direction of the eastern storage barn. The smaller one, where they kept winter feed stores and equipment. "Fire!" She was already moving, already shouting, not thinking about the sound, just the word. "Fire in the east barn." Everybody up. Kel hit the bunkhouse door about 4 seconds after she did, and Hector was right behind him, and they ran. Dub came out slower with his bad knee and took up position at the water pump by the main barn, which was the right instinct because if the fire jumped, the main barn was what they couldn't afford to lose. The east barn was already well into it when they got there. The wall facing north had caught fully, and the roof was starting to go, and the heat pushed her back 2 steps before she could stop herself. There was no saving the structure. That was immediate and obvious. What they could do was keep it from spreading. She grabbed a canvas tarp from the fence post and started beating at the grass line where sparks were landing. Cale was on the other side of the barn doing the same. Hector ran for the water buckets they kept near the paddock. Gideon was there in under 2 minutes, appearing out of the dark in a way that meant he'd been dressed when the fire started, or dressed very fast, and he assessed it in about 4 seconds. "Grass line," he said, pointing. "Keep it off the fence. Don't try for the building." They worked for 40 minutes. The east barn burned completely. By the time the structure came down in a low, exhausted collapse of blackened timber, the grass line was beaten back and the fire was contained. Rowan's hands were blistered again, worse than when she'd arrived, and in different places, and her eyes were burning from the smoke, and she was sitting in the dirt near the water pump because her legs had stopped cooperating. Reba brought water, not gently. She pushed the cup at Rowan and said, "Drink," in the same voice she used to say, "Sweep and eat," and stop standing there, and Rowan drank. Gideon walked the perimeter of the burned structure twice. Then he went to the north wall, or what had been the north wall, and crouched down near the base. He stayed there for a while. When he came back, his face was the expression she'd seen with the cattle, only deeper. "Accelerant," he said quietly, to her specifically. "The char pattern at the base. It didn't start from inside. She'd already suspected it. They're accelerating the pressure." "Yes." He looked at the destroyed structure. 2 months of winter feed. The equipment stored there. A plow, 2 harnesses, tools. He said it without emotion, cataloging the losses the way she'd have entered them in a ledger. Maybe $300 of loss, total. $300 was more than she could repay in years at current wages. She knew he knew this, and she knew he wasn't saying it to wound her. "We're going to have a hard winter if we can't replace the feed stores before the cold comes," he said. "How long do we have?" 2 months? Maybe a little more. Cale was leaning against the paddock fence nearby, still black-faced from smoke, watching the embers. He said without looking at either of them, "This ain't going to stop with the barn, is it?" It wasn't a question. Gideon answered it anyway. "No," he said, "it's not." 3 days after the fire, Rowan was in the main house working on the accounts when she heard horses again and went to the window. 4 men this time. She didn't recognize any of them, which was in some ways worse than recognizing them. Unknown men with that posture and that pace were a different category of problem. She went to find Gideon. He was already coming from the barn, having heard them. They stood together on the porch as the 4 men pulled up, and the man in front, big, red-faced, with a folded paper in his hand that had the official look of a legal document, looked from Gideon to Rowan and back. "Gideon Mercer," he said. "Yes." The man handed down the folded paper. "Notice of land survey dispute. The county assessor's office has opened a formal review of the eastern pasture boundary. You're required to present your title documentation at the county office within 30 days, or the land reverts to open status." Gideon took the paper. He didn't open it. "Who filed the dispute?" "That information is in the notice." "I'm asking you." The man's jaw tightened. Aldous Crane filed a complaint claiming the original survey markers were incorrectly placed when your title was registered 12 years ago. Gideon said nothing. He held the paper at his side and looked at the man with that flat, steady look that Rowan had come to understand was not passivity, but a very controlled form of pressure. "Anything else?" Gideon said. "The notice is the notice." The man looked at Rowan again. "And I've been asked to inform you that the outstanding warrant for Rowan Hale is still active, and that the legal protection you've claimed under territorial statute is under review by county legal counsel." "Under review?" Rowan said. "By Crane's attorneys, you mean?" The man didn't answer that. "Thank you," Gideon said. "You've delivered your notice." They left. Gideon went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and opened the paper. She sat across from him and watched him read it, and when he finished, he set it flat and put both hands on the table like he needed the surface to be solid under him. "He's going after the land itself now," she said. "The eastern pasture is 60 acres of my best grazing. It's what makes the upper herd viable." He looked at the paper. "Without it, the ranch operates at a loss." "Can you fight it?" "I can file a counter-response with my original title documents. A real land attorney would help." He paused. "I heard back from someone yesterday about the attorney. He's willing to take the case, but he wants $200 up front." $200? She did the arithmetic without wanting to. Between the lost feed stores and the dead cattle and now legal fees, they were looking at a number that could break the ranch before winter if Crane kept applying pressure systematically. "I have the wages you've been paying me," she said. $63. That's yours. It can be ours. She said it without looking at him because looking at him made the conversation harder and she needed it to be practical right now. I'm not a guest here. Whatever is mine is the ranch's, same as anyone else who works here. You know that. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not taking your wages. I'm not offering them as charity. I'm offering them as a partner in a venture that is currently under attack, some portion of which is my responsibility. She did look at him now. Don't be proud about this, Gideon. We don't have the margin for pride. His jaw moved. He didn't like it, but he nodded. She went and got the envelope from under her mattress and put $63 on the kitchen table, and he looked at it for a moment and then put his hand over it and slid it toward him. Neither of them commented on the fact that they'd just had an argument about money in the kitchen, like a couple that had been married for years instead of 3 weeks on paper. That evening, Reba made cornbread and put extra honey on the table, which was her version of comfort, and they ate it in the specific silence of people who were too tired to talk and too worried to sleep, and had decided, somewhere below the level of conscious decision, that they were in this together until it ended one way or another. The idea about the church came from an unlikely source. Dub had been listening. Rowan had noticed this about him over the weeks. He was a man who appeared to be barely present, hobbling around on his bad knee and making vague observations about weather and fence quality, but he absorbed everything. He'd been on this ranch for 9 years, and 9 years meant he'd watched, and Dub had the memory of a man with not much else to do but remember. He found Rowan at this woodpile 2 evenings after the legal notice had arrived, and he stood there for a moment pretending to look at the sky. "You know what's in that church?" he said. She stopped. "What church?" "Boone's Church, in Callaway Crossing." He picked up a piece of wood, turned it over. "I did some work there, 7, 8 years back. Before all this, before Crane got his hooks into the whole county." He set the wood down. "There's a room behind the vestry. Not on any plan I ever saw. Just a room, no bigger than a closet. Boone was real particular about who went near it." Rowan was very still. "How do you know about it?" "I built the wall that hides the door," Dub said. "Boone paid me extra to keep my mouth shut, and I did, for 7 years. He looked at her with his weathered, half-squinting face. "I'm tired of keeping my mouth shut." She went to Gideon that night. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet in that way that meant he was working through the risk calculus, not the moral calculus, she thought. He'd made his moral decision weeks ago, but the practical math of what this would require. "Going into Callaway Crossing," he said, "with a warrant still active against you. At night. We don't need long. If there's a ledger or documents in that room, if Dub built the room, he's not guessing. He's saying there's a hidden room. That's not the same as saying there's evidence in it." He looked at her. "And even if there is, evidence we obtain by breaking into a church, Boone is dirty. Whatever's in that room, it wasn't put there for good reasons. I know that. I'm saying a territorial court might have a view about how we obtained it." She thought about that. He wasn't wrong. If the federal agent receives our letter and opens an investigation, evidence he finds in that room through legal means is clean, Gideon finished. He was quiet again. "But we haven't heard from Aldridge." "No. And Crane is moving faster. The land survey, the warrant review, the fire." He stood up and walked to the window. "He's trying to break us before help can arrive. He knows we reached out to someone. Maybe not who, but he knows we're trying to go over his head. Then we need something that makes us harder to break." She stood up too. "If we get into that room and find what Dub thinks is there, real documentation, Boone's own records, it changes the equation. It's not just my copies of Crane's books anymore. It's a second source. Independent." He turned from the window. "It's dangerous. Everything we're doing is dangerous." She met his eyes. "I'd rather take the risk on purpose than wait for them to break us down slowly." He looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight, his face showed more than it usually did. The exhaustion, the weight of what had been landing on him week after week, and underneath that something else. Something she was carefully not naming. "We go when the moon is down," he said. 2 nights from now, just the 2 of us." He paused. "And we get in and get out fast. No heroics." "Agreed." "Rowan." He said her name the way he rarely did, with weight. "If this goes wrong, It's going to go wrong, she said. Everything goes wrong. We just have to make sure we go wrong in the direction we can survive. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before it disappeared. She noted it the same way she noted everything now, in the part of her mind that was keeping a careful, accurate record of every moment that mattered. They rode out 2 nights later under a sky with no moon and more stars than seemed strictly necessary, following the back route through the pine country that Dub had sketched out for them on a piece of paper that Gideon had memorized and burned. The horses picked their way through familiar darkness, and neither of them spoke much because there wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said. Callaway Crossing was quiet at 3 in the morning. Even the saloon's light was out. They left the horses at the tree line east of town and went the rest of the way on foot, staying off the main road, moving through the spaces between buildings with the particular kind of careful that made every sound feel too loud. The church was dark. The side door, which Dub had told them about, the one that the deacons used during the week, the one with the older lock, yielded to a method that Gideon apparently knew from some earlier chapter of his life that he didn't explain and she didn't ask about. They were inside in under a minute. The vestry was behind the main hall, and the room was behind the vestry, and the wall looked exactly like a wall. She would never have found the door without Dub's description. 3 boards from the left corner, the middle one slightly proud of the others, a specific pressure point at knee height. Gideon pressed it. The panel swung inward on hinges that had been recently oiled, which told her something about how often this room was used. Inside, shelves. A small table with a lamp unlit. And on the shelves, in neat stacks that spoke of someone very organized and very careful, ledgers, dozens of them, going back from the dates on the spines, at least 15 years. She stood in the doorway for a moment and just looked at it. There it is, she said. Gideon moved past her into the room and started examining spines. She followed. They didn't have much time. They couldn't take the ledgers. Missing ledgers would alert Boone immediately. But she'd brought paper and a pencil, and she started copying the key entries she found in the most recent volumes while Gideon held the shielded lantern they'd brought and kept one ear toward the door. She worked fast. Her handwriting wasn't its neatest, but it was legible, and she knew what she was looking for. The same pattern she'd found in Crane's books. The same kind of split accounting, money going in one direction on the official record and a different direction in the real one. She found names she recognized and names she didn't. She found amounts that made her breath go short. She was 20 minutes in, 6 pages of notes filled, when Gideon said quietly, "Someone's outside." She stopped writing. Light. Coming from the north end of town. His voice was completely level. "Moving this way." She looked at her notes. 6 pages. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And it was enough of something that she could feel it in her chest, the specific weight of evidence. "How many?" "Can't tell yet." He moved away from the door and came back. "More than 1 lamp." She folded the pages and put them inside her shirt against her skin. Gideon was already at the vestry door, looking out. "Back door," he said. They moved. She pulled the panel wall closed behind her, made sure it clicked, and followed him through the vestry and into the back passage. The side door was still unlocked. They slipped out. The night air hit her cold and full of sound. Footsteps. Voices low but coming closer. And then a light sweeping around the corner of the building that caught the side of her coat as she pressed against the exterior wall. Gideon grabbed her arm and pulled her into the gap between the church and the adjacent building, into complete darkness. The light passed. She could hear breathing, his, controlled, right beside her in the dark, and her own, which she was working to slow. The voices stopped outside the church's main door, a key in a lock. The door opening. They didn't wait to hear more. Gideon's hand was still on her arm, and he moved and she moved with him, staying against the building faces, staying out of any light, working back toward the tree line by the longest and most careful route. They found the horses. They rode. Neither of them spoke until they'd cleared the town's edge and were back into the pine country, and then Rowan said with her heart still somewhere in her throat, "That was Boone. One of those voices was Boone." "I know." He was going to the room. At 3 in the morning. Gideon kept his eyes on the track ahead, which means he knows something's moving. Someone told him to check. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the folded pages through her shirt. "They know we're coming." "They might." If they find the panel disturbed, we didn't disturb it. You closed it clean. He paused. But they'll be more careful now, tighter. She thought about the 6 pages inside her shirt. 6 pages of Boone's records in her own hand. Combined with her copies of Crane's books, it was beginning to look like something a federal investigator could build a case on. But beginning to look like something and being enough were different things, and they both knew it. They were a mile outside town when they saw the riders, not behind them. Ahead, blocking the road where it narrowed between 2 stone outcroppings, 3 horses standing still, 3 men with rifles across their saddles. They'd been waiting. Set here in advance, not chasing. It was a trap, and they'd ridden straight into it. Gideon pulled up immediately, one hand out to slow her. She stopped alongside him and looked at the 3 men and the rifles and the narrow road and thought very fast about every direction that wasn't forward. "Mercer." The voice came from the middleman. She didn't know the voice. "Thought you'd be along this way?" Gideon said nothing. "Crane sends his regards. He says you've made this considerably more complicated than it needed to be." A pause. "The woman hands over whatever she took from that church. You both ride home, and this ends tonight." She felt the folded pages against her skin like they had their own heat. "And if we say no?" Gideon said. The man on the right shifted his rifle. "Then you don't ride home." She looked sideways at Gideon. His hands were on the reins, still, controlled. The same posture he had when he was doing arithmetic on an unpleasant sum. She moved her hand toward her coat. "Don't," he said, quiet and quick, without looking at her. Not telling her not to fight, telling her to wait. Just a half second. Wait. She waited. And then, from the ridgeline to the east, a voice came out of the dark that none of them had expected. Federal Marshal Service. Clear, flat, carrying. "Weapons down, all of you. Right now." The man who came down off the ridge was not what Rowan had pictured when she'd imagined a federal marshal. She'd pictured someone large and self-certain, the kind of man who filled a doorway. What she got was someone medium height and lean, maybe 50 years old, with a gray beard trimmed close and a duster that had seen more weather than most people lived through. He rode a dark horse with no particular markings, and he came down the slope at a pace that said he wasn't afraid of the 3 men with rifles, which either meant he was very good at his job or very tired of being alive. From the look of him, it might have been both. He had 2 deputies behind him on the ridge, which explained the confidence. The 3 men on the road looked at each other with the particular expression of people recalculating. The rifles came down slowly, not because they wanted to cooperate, but because they were doing the same arithmetic Rowan was doing, and the arithmetic came out the same way for everyone. "Elias Aldridge," the marshal said, stopping his horse between the blocked road and Gideon's position. He didn't look at Rowan yet. He looked at the 3 men. "You 3 are going to turn your horses around and ride back to wherever Crane keeps you, and you're going to tell him that the federal investigation into the Callaway Crossing Land Office is now open and active, and that any further interference with witnesses or evidence will result in charges." He paused. "Is that clear enough, or do I need to write it down?" The middleman said something under his breath. Aldridge waited. After a moment, all 3 turned and rode back up the road into the dark. Only then did Aldridge turn to look at Gideon and then at Rowan, and his expression shifted into something that wasn't quite relief, but was in the neighborhood of it. "You look worse than your letter suggested," he said to Gideon. "You took 3 weeks," Gideon said. "I was in the middle of something else. I came as fast as I reasonably could." He looked at Rowan. "You're the bookkeeper." "I am." "You have documentation." She pressed her hand against her chest, where the folded pages still sat inside her shirt. "Some of it, enough to show the pattern. There's more inside the church we just came from. A hidden room behind the vestry with 15 years of Boone's private ledgers. We couldn't take them without alerting him, but I have copied entries from the most recent volumes." She paused. "The room was there. I can describe its exact location. You can get into it legally in a way we couldn't." Aldridge looked at her steadily for a moment. He had the eyes of a man who'd been lied to professionally for decades and had developed a very accurate instrument for detecting it. "What were you doing in that church tonight?" he said. "Looking for evidence. Breaking in. Yes." "And if I hadn't shown up just now?" "We'd have been in serious trouble," she said. "But I'd have kept the notes." Something moved in his face. Not quite approval, but recognition. "All right, he said. "Ride with us. We need to talk." They made camp 2 miles south of town, in a hollow off the main road where Aldridge's two deputies, a young woman named Sadie with a deputy's badge and a watchful quality, and a quiet man named Forrest, who spoke maybe 12 words all night, set up a fire and produced coffee from somewhere. Rowan sat across from Aldridge with the 6 pages of notes spread on a flat rock between them and walked him through everything she had, starting from the moment she'd found the second set of books in Crane's office and ending with tonight. He listened the way experienced investigators listened, without expression, without interrupting, occasionally making a small note of his own. When she finished, he picked up her pages and read them again slowly. "The original copies you made from Crane's office," he said. "Where are they?" "At the ranch. Hidden." "I'll need those." "I know. I'll give them to you." She looked at him directly. "I need to know what happens next, not in vague terms. Actually, what happens?" Aldridge set the pages down. "A federal investigation into land grant fraud carries a mandatory review by the territorial court. What you've described, if it holds up, and this," he tapped her notes, "suggests it will, is not just county corruption. Federal grant money was diverted. That makes it federal fraud, which takes it entirely out of Mesa's jurisdiction. Crane, Boone, anyone else involved faces federal charges." "How long does that take?" "The investigation itself, assuming I can get into that church legally in the next 48 hours, and the ledgers are what you say they are. Weeks, maybe 2 months. The trial, longer." He looked at her. "It's not fast. During which time the warrant against me. I'm issuing a federal hold on all local warrants connected to the land office case as of tonight. That supersedes Mesa's county warrant." He picked up his coffee. "You're not legally safe, but you're significantly safer than you were 3 hours ago." She let herself breathe. Actually breathe, the full kind. The kind she'd been withholding for weeks without fully realizing it. Gideon, sitting beside her, said nothing, but she felt something shift in his posture, that particular release of tension that happens in a person who's been holding weight for so long they've stopped noticing until someone else helps carry it. "The land survey dispute," Gideon said. "Crane filed against my eastern pasture. If Crane is indicted on federal charges, any civil actions he's filed become subject to review," Aldridge said. "I can't promise that disappears overnight, but a man facing federal fraud prosecution typically stops pursuing property disputes." Gideon nodded slowly. "The 3 men on the road tonight," Rowan said. "What happens to them?" "Depends on what they tell me. Men like that usually know where the exits are." Aldridge looked at the fire. "Crane's network is wide, but it's only strong because people are afraid of him. When fear starts to look like a worse option than testimony, the network breaks down fast." He glanced at her. "It always breaks down faster than the people at the top expect." She thought about that, about Pryor, who delivered the warrant and then told Gideon he's not going to stop in a voice that had sounded almost like regret, about the unnamed deputy who'd stood in the yard and said nothing both times, about all the people in Callaway Crossing who'd crossed the street rather than acknowledge her, who'd closed their doors, who'd listened to Boone's sermon and gone home and maybe lay awake afterward. Fear was a weight that got heavier over time. She knew that personally. "There's a woman," she said, "Clara DuPont. She runs a boarding house in town. She helped me when no one else would. She should be protected." Aldridge wrote the name down without being asked. That small act, the writing of Clara's name without argument, told Rowan more about this man than anything he'd said so far. They rode back to Stone Hollow before dawn, arriving as the sky was going gray-pink in the east, and Reba was building up the kitchen fire. Reba looked at them when they came in, at the smoke smell in their clothes, the exhaustion in their faces, and the specific quality of 2 people who had been through something and come out the other side of it still standing. And she put 2 cups of coffee on the table and went back to the stove without asking a single question. Rowan went upstairs and got the oilcloth bundle from under the mattress and brought it down and set it on the table. Gideon looked at it. "You sure?" "Aldridge is the right person to have these. If they stay here and something happens to this ranch, nothing's going to happen to this ranch." "If something does," she said, "the evidence is worth more than my sense of control over it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. She rewrapped the bundle and set it by the door for when Aldridge's deputy came to collect it, which had been arranged. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and felt the solid weight of the wood under her palms, and thought about nothing for about 30 seconds, which was the first time she'd been able to think about nothing in longer than she could clearly remember. Reba set a plate of biscuits on the table. Gideon sat across from her. Outside, the ranch was waking up. She could hear Cale in the paddock, Hector's low voice somewhere near the barn. "It's not over," she said. Not to him in particular, just to the room. "No," he agreed. "But it's different now." He picked up a biscuit. "It's different now." They ate breakfast in the particular silence that was beginning to feel less like absence and more like a thing that belonged to them specifically. She noticed this and did not comment on it. What followed was the slow, grinding, deeply unglamorous work of a federal investigation in a territory that didn't want one. Aldridge secured a federal warrant and entered Boone's church 2 days later, in daylight, with 2 deputies and a territorial court officer, and a written order that Boone's attorney, dispatched hastily from somewhere south, tried and failed to block. The hidden room was exactly where Rowan had described it. The ledgers were there. All of them. She heard this from Aldridge's deputy Sadie, who came to the ranch to collect the oilcloth bundle, and stayed long enough to drink one of Reba's coffees and confirm the basics. Sadie was maybe 28, with a practical efficiency that Rowan recognized as the quality of a woman who'd learned early to do everything twice as well to be taken half as seriously, and they had a brief, direct conversation at the kitchen table while Gideon and Forrest talked outside. "Boone's been there," Sadie said. "After you. The room was relocked, but some of the ledgers had been moved. You could tell by the dust patterns. He was looking for something. To see if anything was taken." "Most likely. Nothing was, technically." Sadie looked at her. "Your copies were good. The entries you recorded match what we found." Rowan absorbed that. The 6 pages inside her shirt in that dark room, her hand moving fast by lantern light while Gideon listened at the door. All of that had mattered. "Is it enough?" she asked. "It's a strong start. We need corroborating testimony." Sadie paused. "We need people who were there, who participated, who'll talk." "They're afraid." "They usually are." Sadie finished her coffee. "That's why the testimony that matters most is usually the last person anyone expects to break." She rode out with the oilcloth bundle, and Rowan stood on the porch and watched her go and thought about who in Callaway Crossing was most afraid and most tired of being afraid. The answer, when it came, surprised her. It was Pryor. Walt Pryor arrived at the Stone Hollow gate on a Thursday afternoon, alone, without his badge. She noticed that immediately, the absence of it on his chest where it had always been before. He rode in slowly and called out before he got close, which was the behavior of a man who understood he wasn't welcome and was trying to signal that he wasn't a threat. Gideon came out with his hand at his side. Rowan came out behind him. Pryor looked at her. He looked older than she remembered, or maybe just more tired. "I'd like to talk," he said. "To both of you, if you'll let me." Gideon looked at Rowan. She gave him a small nod. They sat on the porch, all 3 of them, and Pryor talked for a long time. He talked about Mace, who'd brought him into the arrangement 6 years ago and framed it as just bending a few rules, just looking the other way on some land paperwork, just being practical about how things worked in this county. He talked about the way it had grown, each year a little more, each year the price of getting out a little higher than the year before, until the thing he'd agreed to originally was unrecognizable, and he was in deep enough that the threat of exposure was as strong a chain as anything else. "I didn't burn your barn," he said to Gideon. His voice was steady, but something under it wasn't. "I want you to know that. I don't know who did it, but it wasn't me, and I didn't order it." "Who did?" Gideon said. "Crane has people I don't know. Hired men from outside the county. When it started getting physical, I told Mace I wanted out, and he told me—" He stopped. Started again. "He told me what would happen if I left." Rowan looked at him. "You're here because of the federal investigation. I'm here because—" He paused. "Because I watched them run you out of town for telling the truth. I watched what they did to your house. And then I watched them come after a man who had nothing to do with any of it just because he did the decent thing." He looked at Gideon. "I've done a lot of things I can't fix. This is one I maybe can." The porch was quiet for a moment. A bird somewhere in the tree line called and stopped. You'll testify, Rowan said. Not a question. I'll testify. I'll give Aldridge everything I have. Names, dates, every instruction Mace gave me. He looked at his hands. I've already sent word to Aldridge. He knows I'm here. She looked at Gideon again. His face was doing that thing it did, the controlled arithmetic. She could almost see him weighing it, the man who'd delivered the warrant against her, who'd been part of the system that burned her out of her home, sitting on their porch asking for a kind of absolution that wasn't theirs to give or withhold. You'll face charges yourself, Gideon said, for your own part in it. I know. And you're going anyway. Pryor met his eyes. I'm going anyway. The arithmetic resolved into something. Not forgiveness. That was too large and too personal, and not the right shape for a porch conversation between a man who'd done wrong and the people he'd done it to. But something functional, something that acknowledged the situation was what it was. All right, Gideon said. Pryor nodded. He stood up. He looked at Rowan one more time. For what it's worth, I never believed what they said about you stealing, from the beginning. He put his hat on. That's not worth much, I know. No, she said, but it's something. He rode out. Chat. Over the following weeks, the structure that Crane and Boone had built over 15 years began to come apart, the way large constructed things do when the key piece fails. Not all at once, but in cascading sequence, each collapse creating pressure on the next. Pryor's testimony opened a door. Behind it were others. A county clerk who'd been falsifying survey records, 2 men who'd participated in the fraudulent land allocations without fully understanding the scope, a woman who worked in Mace's office and had been copying official correspondence for Crane for 3 years and was ready to stop. Each testimony added specificity and weight to what Rowan's documentation had started. The picture that emerged was not of a simple scheme, but of something that had been deliberately constructed over a long period. With Crane at the center, and Boone providing legitimacy, and Mace providing legal cover, and money flowing outward to enough people that fear had become the architecture holding the whole thing up. When fear stopped working, the architecture failed. Aldridge sent word to Rowan through Sadie every few days. She read each update at the kitchen table, sometimes alone, sometimes with Gideon sitting across from her, and she built a map in her notebook of how the case was developing, not because Aldridge needed her to, but because she needed to see it taking shape. She needed to watch it becoming real. Mace was arrested on a Thursday morning, which she heard about from a freight rider passing through. He'd apparently said nothing when the federal deputies came, just stood in the middle of his office and looked at the wall while they read the charges, which somehow seemed right for him. Crane fought it. Of course he did. His attorneys filed objections and challenged the federal jurisdiction and produced character witnesses and submitted a lengthy counter-complaint alleging that the investigation itself was politically motivated. Aldridge, who had seen this pattern many times before, let the attorneys do their work and continued building the case beneath them. Boone disappeared for 4 days, which scared her more than anything else that happened, because men who ran were men who hadn't decided yet how bad they were willing to be. He came back on his own, turned himself into Aldridge's office in Weston on a Wednesday afternoon, his attorney beside him, looking like a man who'd run the math and found no favorable outcome. His attorneys were already negotiating the terms of his cooperation. She heard all of this and wrote it down and kept working, because the ranch still needed working. The South herd still needed moving. The account still needed keeping. The damaged outbuilding needed rebuilding before winter, and Cale and Hector had started on it with Gideon's direction, and she'd found herself out there 3 afternoons in a row, handing up lumber and passing nails and being absolutely useless at it in ways that made Cale laugh, which was fine. She didn't mind being laughed at for incompetence in carpentry. There were worse things to be bad at. One evening, late, she was at the table with the notebook when Gideon came downstairs. He'd started doing this more, coming down in the evenings instead of staying upstairs, finding a reason to be in the kitchen. Neither of them had remarked on it. He sat down and looked at the notebook. How does it look? Like it's going to work? She said it carefully, because she'd learned not to be certain about things she couldn't control. Aldridge says the trial will be in Weston, territorial court, federal oversight. He wants me to testify. I know, he told me. She looked up. He talked to you? He wanted to know if I had anything to add about the fire, the cattle, the land survey dispute. Gideon's expression was neutral. I told him everything. You didn't tell me he contacted you. You were busy. Gideon, he looked at her. I didn't want to add it to everything else you were carrying. She held his gaze for a moment. There was something both irritating and unexpectedly considerate about this, and she wasn't sure which quality outweighed the other. We're supposed to be in this together. We are. Then that means both directions. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the measured honesty that was the most characteristic thing about him, I'm not used to operating that way. I know, she said. Neither am I. They looked at each other across the table in the lamplight, and she thought about Reba saying, maybe you keep telling yourself that on the ride back from Harlow Junction, and she thought about a woman named Margaret who'd been smarter than anyone gave her credit for, and she thought about how you could arrive at a place intending only to survive and find, somewhere along the way, that you'd started building something instead. She didn't say any of this. She closed the notebook and put it on the table between them. The trial is in 6 weeks, she said. Aldridge needs me to prepare testimony. I'll need access to all the documentation. It's yours, all of it. I'll need time to work through it properly. Take whatever you need. She nodded. Outside, the valley was dark and the creek ran somewhere and the horses were quiet in the paddock and the rebuilt wall of the outbuilding stood pale and new against the dark timber of the older structure. Not beautiful, not seamless, just solid and present and done. I want to win this, she said. Not loudly, just the plain truth of it. I know, Gideon said. Not just for me, for everyone they ran out, everyone they silenced, everyone who crossed the street instead of... She stopped. Started again. There are people in that town who've been afraid for a long time. When this is over, I want them to be able to stop being afraid. He looked at her for a long moment, and his face in the lamplight showed something that he usually kept somewhere she couldn't see. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, very close to admiration. Then we'll win it, he said. She picked up her pencil and opened the notebook again and started writing, and he stayed at the table across from her, and neither of them needed anything more than that. The territorial courthouse in Weston was a 2-story sandstone building that smelled of old paper and wood oil, and the particular staleness of a place where difficult things had been decided for a long time. Rowan had been inside it twice before the trial, once to meet with Aldridge and the territorial prosecutor, a thin, precise man named Harwick, who spoke in complete sentences and took notes on everything, and once to walk the room itself, alone, to get the feeling of it out of her system before it mattered. She did this because she knew herself well enough to know that unfamiliar spaces made her uncertain, and uncertainty in front of a crowd was something she couldn't afford. So she sat in the witness chair with the empty room around her and looked at where the judges would sit, and where the defense table would be, and where the gallery would fill with people, and she let herself feel afraid in private so she wouldn't have to feel it in public. It helped. Not completely, but enough. The trial began on a Tuesday in early October, 6 weeks after Aldridge had come down off that ridge and turned the night around. The gallery was full from the first morning. People from Weston, and people from Callaway Crossing, and people from small settlements across the territory who'd heard what the charges were and come to see if it was real. Rowan recognized faces from her old town. Some of them looked away when she looked at them. Some didn't. Crane sat at the defense table in a good suit, flanked by 2 attorneys, and he looked at the proceedings with the expression of a man who had not yet fully accepted that this was happening to him. His silver watch chain was visible. He'd worn it to court, which struck Rowan as the kind of detail that revealed everything about a person. The inability to set aside the symbols of power even when the power itself was dissolving. Mace sat 2 chairs down from him, looking at the table. Boone was at the far end, thinner than she remembered, his bearing diminished in the way that happened to men who'd spent their lives being looked up to and suddenly weren't. Harwick opened the case with the measured, almost understated efficiency of someone who didn't need drama because the facts were dramatic enough. He laid out the structure of the scheme, the federal land grants, the falsified surveys, the split ledgers, the 15 years of systematic theft that had touched nearly every major property transaction in the county. He named amounts. He named dates. He named people. The courtroom was very quiet while he talked. Rowan testified on the 3rd day. She'd prepared for 2 weeks. She knew the documentation by memory at this point. Every entry she'd copied from Crane's books, every name in Boone's ledgers, every date and amount and discrepancy. She'd practiced her answers with Harwick until he told her to stop because she was over-preparing, which she recognized was true but couldn't fully stop doing. She walked to the witness stand and sat down and looked at the courtroom, and the first thing she saw was Gideon in the gallery, third row on the left. He wasn't looking at her with encouragement or anxiety. He was just looking at her the way he looked at things. Steady, present, painful attention. That was enough. In fact, that was exactly the right thing, and she wasn't sure he knew that, but it settled something in her chest that had been loose all morning. Harwick walked her through the timeline. She answered each question directly, without elaboration where it wasn't needed, and with precision where it was. She described finding the second ledger in Crane's office. She described copying the entries. She described going to Mace and what had happened after. She described the weeks in Calloway Crossing as the community closed around her like a fist. She described arriving at Stone Hollow and what had followed. The visits, the threats, the dead cattle, the fire, the document in Boone's hidden room. She didn't perform any of it. She just said what had happened, in order, with the dates she'd recorded in her notebook. Her voice stayed level, which cost her something she wouldn't quantify. Then Crane's lead attorney stood up for cross-examination, and she recognized immediately that he was going to try to make her the subject of the trial rather than his client. He was good at it. He came at her from angles, her character, her history, her motivations. He suggested she'd fabricated the documentation out of resentment after being dismissed. He raised the original theft allegation with the practiced delicacy of a man planting a seed he intended to water over several minutes. He asked about her marriage to Gideon in a tone that implied it was a conspiracy rather than a legal protection. She answered every question. She didn't get angry, which she could feel him trying to provoke. She didn't get flustered. She got more specific, which she'd found was the best defense against implication. You couldn't make precise facts disappear by casting shade on the person stating them. At one point, he held up her handwritten copies of Crane's ledger entries and said, "These were produced by you, in your own hand, with no witness. How can this court verify they reflect genuine records and not your own invention?" "Because," she said, "the original records are in evidence. The entries I copied are on page 14, 41, and 67 of the primary ledger your client kept in the bottom drawer of his locked desk. The court can compare them directly." A murmur went through the gallery. The attorney moved on. He didn't come back to that particular line of questioning. When she stepped down from the stand, her legs were steadier than she expected. She walked back to her seat and sat down and stared at the front of the room, and after a moment she felt Gideon's hand close briefly over hers on the bench between them. Not a romantic gesture, just contact, just the physical weight of another person acknowledging that she'd done something hard and done it right. And then he moved his hand away, and they both looked at the front of the room again. Pryor testified the following morning. He was in the room for nearly 4 hours. He testified to receiving instructions from Mace about the land survey falsifications. He described specific conversations about Rowan, decisions made about how to handle her complaint, how to construct the theft allegation, how to ensure the community pressure was applied in the right direction. He named men who had participated in the intimidation campaign against Stone Hollow Ranch. He identified, by name and role, 7 people beyond the 3 primary defendants who had knowingly participated in various aspects of the scheme. He testified to all of it in a flat, factual voice that occasionally cracked on specific details and then went flat again. He looked at no one in the gallery except once, near the end, when he looked directly at Rowan for about 2 seconds and then looked away. She thought about what he'd said on the porch. "I never believed what they said about you." And she thought about how little that had meant then, and how it meant something different now. Not enough to make the past different, but enough to make the present slightly less straightforward. People were complicated in ways she sometimes didn't want to deal with. Pryor was a man who'd done real harm and was now doing real good and would face real consequences, and she'd never quite be at peace with the full picture of him. That was just the truth of it. She didn't look back at him when he left the stand. The defense made its case over 3 days and presented nothing that Harwick's preparation hadn't already anticipated and answered. The character witnesses seemed to understand they were performing a ritual rather than actually changing anything. Crane's own testimony, he insisted on testifying over the evident discomfort of his attorneys, but was the most revealing part, not for what he admitted, but for what he couldn't stop himself from revealing. A man who fundamentally believed that what he'd done was simply how power worked, that the problem wasn't the fraud, but the fact that someone had looked too closely. He said at one point, calmly, almost conversationally, that the land grant allocations had been managed inefficiently by the federal program and that he'd simply ensured the resources went where they would be most effective. He said it like it made sense, like it had always made sense to him. Rowan sat in the gallery and watched him say this and understood something she'd been trying to articulate for months, that the worst thing about men like Crane wasn't their greed. Greed was at least comprehensible. It was the absolute certainty that they were entitled to operate the way they operated, that the rules existed for other people, that the people who got hurt were simply the cost of things working properly. That certainty was what made them dangerous long past the point where any reasonable person would have stopped. And that certainty was exactly what the trial was about dismantling. Not just in this room, but in every room where what happened in Callaway Crossing had touched people who'd accepted it because they couldn't see any other option. The jury was out for less than one day. Guilty. All three primary defendants on all major counts. She heard the word and felt nothing for about 4 seconds, which was the delayed reaction of a person whose body needed a moment to understand that something it had been braced against was no longer coming. Then she felt something large and complicated move through her chest. Not triumph, not quite relief. Closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you've been carrying so long, you'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. Her eyes went to the floor. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and breathed. Beside her, Gideon made no sound. But she could see his jaw working slightly, that private processing he did when something landed harder than he'd prepared for. Reba, who had come for the last 2 days of the trial and was sitting 2 seats down, said, "Good," in a voice that was completely calm, like she'd been waiting to say it for months, because she had. The sentencing happened the following week. Crane received 12 years on federal fraud charges. Mace received 8. Boone, whose cooperation and testimony in the final days had been factored in, received 5. The 7 others named by Pryor received varying sentences. Pryor himself received 18 months on a reduced charge, which was what cooperation with a federal investigation looked like in practice. Not clean, not painless, but present. Harwick shook Rowan's hand afterward in the courthouse hallway and said she'd been the clearest and most useful witness he'd worked with in 11 years of federal prosecution. She thanked him. She meant it. She also understood that she'd been a useful instrument in a larger process, which was fine. Useful was good. Useful had been enough to bring down something that had seemed immovable, and she was not going to diminish that. Tick. They drove back to Stone Hollow 2 days later, the 4 of them, Rowan, Gideon, Reba, and Hector, who had insisted on coming to Weston for the verdict and had stood in the back of the gallery with his hat in his hands and his face absolutely composed. The wagon road north was the same road Rowan had traveled the first time, the same red clay ruts winding through scrub pine and switchgrass. But it felt different now in the way that a road feels different when you know where you're going. Reba fell asleep against the wagon side somewhere around the 2nd hour, which was her way of indicating that the crisis was over and ordinary human functions could resume. Hector drove. Rowan sat in the back with Gideon, and they watched the country pass, and after a while Gideon said, "What do you want to do now?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the reason you came here is resolved. The case is done. You could go anywhere." He said it in the even way he said difficult things, which meant it was costing him something. "You're not a prisoner here. You were never—" "I know I wasn't," she said. "I'm saying you have options now that you didn't have when you arrived." She looked at the country around her. The valley coming into view ahead, the creek catching light in the distance, the pale walls of the Stone Hollow buildings low against the hillside. The new outbuilding wall, visible even from here, slightly lighter in color than the old timber around it. "I know I do," she said. "I'm aware of my options." He waited. "This is where I want to be," she said. "That's my answer." He looked at her for a moment. His face did the thing it occasionally did now. That small, involuntary openness, the wall down, not because he'd chosen to put it down, but because the habit of keeping it up had slowly, over these months, begun to fail him. "All right," he said. "That's all you're going to say?" What else do you want me to say? She thought about it. Nothing, actually. That's the right amount. He almost smiled again. She was keeping a private count of those. She was up to 7. Winter came to Stone Hollow with the specific bluntness of high country winters. No warning and no apology, just a morning in November when the temperature dropped 30 degrees before noon and didn't come back. They'd rebuilt the feed stores from what they'd managed to source in the weeks after the trial, not quite what they'd lost, but enough to carry through if the season wasn't too long. Cale had become a reliable hand without anyone formally acknowledging it. Hector's English had improved, or rather the ranch's collective Spanish had improved enough that the gap was smaller. Dub's knee had gotten worse and better depending on the weather, which he used as a barometer and was usually right. Clara DuPont came north in December. She arrived with a wagon and 2 trunks and a look on her face that said she'd made the decision she'd been putting off for years, and was resolved about it even if she wasn't entirely comfortable yet. She'd sold the boarding house. Aldridge had arranged for the federal investigation to include a review of any pressure placed on local businesses, which had given Clara the legal standing to exit the property lease she'd been trapped in. And she was looking for a fresh start somewhere that wasn't Callaway Crossing. Rowan met her at the gate and they stood there for a moment. 2 women who'd known each other in a crisis and were now figuring out if they knew each other in ordinary time, which was a different thing. "You could stay here," Rowan said. "We could use someone who knows how to run a lodging operation. The ranch is growing, and Reba can't do everything." "I'm not charity," Clara said. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering work. Same thing I was offered when I got here." She paused. "Fair wages, room and board, and the right to say no to anything you don't want to do." Clara looked at the ranch, then at Rowan, then at the ranch again, with the specific assessing look of a practical woman evaluating a practical proposition. $4 a month and my own room, Clara said. Done. Reba was less enthusiastic about sharing her kitchen than about anything else that had happened in the preceding year, but she managed it, and by February she and Clara had developed the kind of working relationship between 2 competent women of similar age that looks like constant low-level argument from the outside, but is actually highly efficient, collaborative management. Spring came and the ranch came back to itself. The eastern pasture, the 60 acres Crane had tried to take through the fraudulent survey dispute, was formally confirmed in Gideon's title by the territorial court review that followed the convictions. The banknote was refinanced without difficulty, since the loan officer who'd been slow about it had been one of the 7 named by Pryor and was no longer in a position to be slow about anything. Gideon paid back every creditor and had a brief cold conversation with the bank's regional manager about standards of conduct that he told Rowan about afterward in about 4 sentences, which was 4 sentences more than he usually spent on things that satisfied him. In March, Harwick sent a letter saying the federal land grant program had been formally reinstated in the territory with new oversight procedures, and that 17 families who'd been fraudulently denied homestead allocations over the years would be receiving retroactive approvals. She read the letter at the kitchen table and then read it again and then put it down and sat with it for a while. 17 families, people she'd never know, in places she'd never visit, whose lives had been bent sideways by what Crane and his network had been doing for 15 years. They wouldn't know her name, they had no reason to, but they were getting something back that had been taken from them. And that thread ran from Crane's locked desk drawer through her hands, through every terrible and exhausting thing that had happened over the preceding months, and she was glad she'd pulled it. This was the thing she'd been trying to understand about her own life, she thought. The moment she'd found that second ledger and felt the weight of what it meant, she'd had a choice that wasn't really about courage or principle. It was simpler and harder than that. It was just the question of whether she was the kind of person who could set down what she knew and walk away from it. And she'd found, to her own complicated surprise, that she wasn't. That whatever had been built into her by her father and his careful books and his insistence on things adding up correctly, she was not capable of setting that down. It had cost her nearly everything, and she'd do it again. She folded the letter and added it to the notebook, which had become something different from what she'd intended. Less a legal record and more a history, the specific shape of a year that had changed everything. One evening in April, she and Gideon were on the porch. This had become a thing they did. Not every evening, not formally, just often enough that it had the quality of a habit. He'd bring coffee. She'd bring whatever she was working on and then usually set it down after 10 minutes. They'd watch the valley go dark and the stars come out over the tree line and not say much because not saying much had turned out to be one of their more functional modes. "I want to say something," he said. She looked at him. This was unusual. He rarely announced things. "I wasn't going to. I've been deciding whether to for about 2 months." He held the coffee cup with both hands. "What we said in Harlow Junction about what it was and what it wasn't." She waited. "I think I was wrong," he said, "about what it wasn't." The valley was very quiet. The creek ran somewhere below. She looked at his profile. The angular, weathered face that she knew now in all its variations. The jaw that set when something was hard. The eyes that were flat at a distance and different up close. A man who'd lost things and kept going and stopped expecting much, and then, despite all of that, had stood in a yard full of trouble and said, "I've lost things before. I'm still here." "I know," she said. He turned to look at her. "I've known for a while," she said. "I was waiting for you to catch up." Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile and not quite a laugh, but was somewhere in between, and she thought, there it is. Number 8. And this one was different from all the others because this one stayed. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat there as the dark came down over the valley, and the stars arrived one at a time, and the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet around them. The horses in the paddock, the light in Reba's kitchen window, somewhere Cale's boots on the bunkhouse steps. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't be. There was still the banknote and the hard winters and the endless work and the particular difficulty of 2 stubborn people trying to share a life. There would be mornings when he was impossible and evenings when she was, and there would be things about each other that they'd never fully figure out, because that was what it meant to be actual people, rather than the simplified versions of themselves they'd both been performing for a long time. But they were here. On this land that had tried to be taken, in this valley that had been the end of the road and had turned out to be the beginning of something else entirely. Years later, when people asked Rowan what had come out of everything that had happened, the corruption, the exile, the fire, the trial, she had a few different answers depending on who was asking and what they actually wanted to know. Sometimes she talked about the 17 families and the reinstated grant program and the changed oversight procedures and the way the Territorial Land Office had been restructured in the years following Crane's conviction. Those were the outcomes you could put numbers on, the things that could be documented and pointed to as proof that it had been worth doing. But the answer she gave more often, especially to people who were in the middle of something hard and didn't know if they were going to make it through, was simpler. She said, "The only thing that matters, when everything has been taken from you and you're trying to decide whether to keep going, is whether you still know who you are. Not who you were before the trouble, not who you'll be when it's over. Who you are right now, in the worst of it, when no one is watching and it would be easier to stop." She'd found out who she was in Crane's office with that second ledger in her hands. She'd found it again every morning she'd gotten out of her bunk at Stone Hollow when her hands were blistered and the enemies were still out there and the outcome was still uncertain. She'd found it in the witness chair in a sandstone courthouse in Weston, speaking plainly about what she'd seen and refusing to let a good attorney make her smaller than she was. And she'd found it in something she hadn't expected and couldn't have predicted. In a man who'd told her on her first day that he wasn't in the business of turning people away, who'd planted himself between her and everything coming after her, not because it was safe or smart, but because it was right, and who'd turned out, despite every wall and every year of practice distance, to be one of the least lonely people she'd ever met once you got inside the walls. She and Gideon had a daughter in the second year, a fact that surprised them both more than it probably should have, and a son 3 years after that. The children grew up on the land their parents had refused to lose, running the same pastures and climbing the same fences and listening at night to the creek that ran its slow horseshoe curve through the valley. They were not entirely easy children, which was expected given the raw materials, and the household was not entirely easy either, but it was full and loud and real in the way that things are real when they've been earned. Reba stayed until she decided not to, which was when she was 68 and announced at breakfast one January morning that she was going to live with her sister in the South and that they could manage the kitchen themselves since she'd taught them everything she intended to. She left on a Thursday with Clara driving the wagon and did not look back, which was exactly consistent with every other choice she'd ever made. She sent letters sometimes. They were terse and affectionate in equal proportion. Hector became the ranch's head hand and hired two of his nephews when the operation grew large enough to need them. Cale eventually moved to a homestead of his own 20 miles up the valley, which Gideon helped him file for legally and correctly. He came back every spring to help with the cattle drive and stayed for dinner and left with enough food packed by Clara to last him 2 weeks. Dub's knee got bad enough that he stopped riding and took up mending tack full-time, which he was better at than anyone had expected. The eastern pasture, all 60 acres of it, turned out to be exactly as valuable as the fight for it had suggested. The upper herd thrived. In the good years, the ranch turned a profit that surprised people who'd watched it nearly go under, and in the bad years it survived, which in this country was often the more meaningful achievement. Callaway Crossing changed slowly, the way towns change, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the accumulation of smaller ones, people making different choices than they'd made before because the old choices had turned out to have a price that most of them hadn't been willing to name until someone else named it for them. A new sheriff, an honest one, came in the year after Mace's sentencing. A new land office, with federal oversight, processed claims the way they were supposed to be processed. Some of the people who'd crossed the street rather than acknowledge Rowan eventually acknowledged this fact in the roundabout way that people acknowledge things they weren't proud of. Not directly, not with apology, but in small adjustments of behavior that were visible if you knew what you were looking at. She didn't need the apology. She'd stopped needing things from that town the morning she'd ridden north out of it with a flour sack and a borrowed horse, and the stubborn, unreasonable conviction that the truth mattered enough to carry even when it was heavy. It had been heavy. It had been heavier than she'd known how to prepare for. But she was still carrying it, all these years later, in the form of a life she'd built out of everything they'd tried to use to destroy her. The evidence, the fight, the land, the man, the children running across the pasture in the long evening light. That was what she had. That was what they hadn't been able to take. And not a day went by that she forgot it.